If a voice you lost 7 years ago suddenly calls you again, would you be brave enough to follow it? Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed so you won't miss what comes next. I used to think the sound of an empty road was peaceful. A long stretch of cracked asphalt under fading daylight. No other cars for miles, and nothing but the low hum of an engine to keep you company. But driving back toward Hollow Creek after 7 years, there was nothing peaceful about it. The silence didn't calm me. It pressed against my chest like a weight, reminding me of why I swore I would never set foot in that town again. The camera was mounted on the dashboard, recording everything. At first, I didn't even know why I was filming. Maybe habit, maybe fear. Looking back now, I think a part of me already understood that something was waiting for me there. Something I needed proof of in case no one believed what I was about to see. 7 years ago, my sister disappeared. No clues, no suspects, no body. She walked home from school on a clear afternoon and simply never came back. The town moved on. The police filed their paperwork and called it a runaway case, even though nothing pointed that way. Only I kept looking, at first desperately, then hopelessly. Eventually, I left Hollow Creek behind, trying to bury the grief somewhere the town's shadows couldn't reach me. But 2 nights ago, everything changed. At exactly 3:18 a.m., my phone rang. The number was unknown, and for a moment, I almost let it go to voicemail. But something, call it instinct, call it dread, made me swipe my finger across the screen. I didn't even say hello. There was no need. The voice that whispered my name was one I could never forget. It was my sister, or at least, it sounded like her. The call lasted 6 seconds. She said my name once, then something else I couldn't understand, like words spoken underwater. And then the line went dead. But later, when I checked the call log, my phone showed something impossible. Duration, 2 hours, 14 minutes. A 6-second call that saved as a multi-hour audio file. I played it back, but there was nothing, just silence. A silence that felt too full, too heavy, like someone was breathing behind it. That was the moment something broke inside me. I knew I had to go back. The closer I got to Hollow Creek, the more the world seemed to fade. Trees grew taller, curling over the road as if forming a canopy to block out the sky. The daylight dimmed too fast for the hour, giving everything a washed-out early evening look, even though the sun should have been high. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel. I could feel it, like the town knew I was coming home. Somewhere near the county line, the car radio flickered on by itself. The speakers crackled with static, and at first I thought it was just interference from the hills. But then, the static shifted into something else. 3 faint words emerged, distorted, stretched thin like they were being pulled from far away. "Don't come back." I froze. The words repeated once more, quieter this time, almost swallowed by the static. I switched off the radio, but even in the silence, I swore I could still hear the whisper echoing in the back of my skull. I didn't turn the radio on again. As the road curved into the valley, Hollow Creek appeared between the trees. Small, quiet, a cluster of houses that seemed older than I remembered. The air felt heavier, thick with the scent of wet earth and something metallic that clung to the back of my throat. My pulse quickened as I rolled onto Main Street. The town looked abandoned. Shops that were once open late sat with their windows boarded over. A newspaper stand lay knocked onto its side. Streetlights flickered in broad daylight, buzzing faintly like trapped insects inside the bulbs. A "Welcome to Hollow Creek" sign leaned crookedly, half buried in dead leaves. I slowed to a crawl, staring through the windshield as if the buildings might suddenly come alive. 7 years can change a town, but not like this. Not this fast. Not this completely. I parked near the old bakery, the one my sister and I used to visit after school. The windows were covered from the inside with brown paper. Someone had spray-painted words across the door, but most of the letters were faded beyond recognition. Only 2 remained clear. Stay out. The camera picked up the quiet click of the car door as I stepped outside. The wind moved through the empty street, pushing a swirl of leaves along the gutter. Every footstep felt too loud, too sharp against the silence, as if the whole town were listening. I filmed everything, telling myself it was for documentation, for evidence. But truthfully, I filmed because I didn't want to feel alone. If the camera saw what I saw, then maybe I wasn't losing my mind. I walked toward the old neighborhood. Houses passed by on either side, their yards untended, grass grown tall. Curtains hung motionless in windows, but I couldn't shake the feeling someone stood behind them, watching. I kept telling myself it was paranoia, just the nerves of being back in a place that held too many memories. But that didn't explain why the air felt colder here, or why the skin on my arms prickled like a warning. A dog barked somewhere far in the distance. Then the sound cut off abruptly, leaving the street even quieter. By the time I reached my childhood home, night had begun to creep in. The sky dimmed with an unnatural quickness, as though Hollow Creek decided when the sun should set. I stopped at the front gate and stared at the house I once knew inside and out. The paint had peeled from the siding, revealing gray, splintered wood beneath. The porch steps sagged under their own weight. The front door hung slightly open, just enough to suggest someone had gone through it recently. My throat tightened. I hadn't given anyone a key in years. For a moment, I just stood there, listening to the quiet. Then I lifted the camera and took a slow breath. Coming back here was the last thing I wanted, but the only thing I could do. If there was even the smallest chance my sister was alive, I had to find out what happened. The wind picked up, and the front door creaked wider, as if the house itself were inviting me in, or warning me to stay away. I stepped forward, and the town swallowed me whole. The front door drifted farther open as I approached, pushed by a slow breath of wind that didn't seem to touch anything else. The trees around the house were still, the air outside quiet. Only the entrance seemed alive, as if the house had been expecting me. The moment I stepped onto the porch, the boards let out a long, tired groan under my weight, too loud, too sharp, echoing into the darkness of the open doorway. I paused, with my hand hovering near the frame. The camera light cast a pale circle inside the house, revealing dust dancing in the air like drifting ash. I had expected the house to smell old, dry, maybe moldy. Instead, The air carried a faint trace of something warm, familiar. Something I couldn't identify right away, but that tugged at memories I'd tried not to revisit. It wasn't the scent of rot or decay. It was something almost lived in. The thought unsettled me more than the idea of the house being abandoned. I stepped inside, and the sound of the door closing behind me was softer than I expected, as though careful not to be heard. The living room opened up in front of me, unchanged in layout but wrong in feeling. The furniture was exactly where it used to be. The couch leaned against the left wall. The coffee table had its familiar scratch along the corner from when my sister hit it with her toy wagon. Even the old floor lamp with the crooked shade stood in the same spot near the window. It should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt staged, too precise, too deliberate, like a memory the house was trying to imitate rather than a natural moment frozen in time. I walked farther in, the beam of the camera light gliding across picture frames, bookshelves, and the dusty surface of the TV. My footsteps echoed strangely, bouncing back as if the room were larger than it actually was, as though there were space behind the walls that shouldn't exist. The TV screen, though powered off, reflected the light in a way that made it look almost wet. For a brief second, the reflection warped, stretching like a black ripple across the glass. I blinked, stepped closer, but when I touched the surface, it was cold and solid. I moved on, telling myself fatigue was already playing tricks on me. The hallway leading to the stairs felt tighter than I remembered, narrower, as if the walls had crept inward over the years. The air grew colder as I walked, and the sound of my breathing seemed unnaturally loud. I reached the base of the stairs and lifted the camera higher. Halfway up, on the third step from the top, something caught my eye. A single small footprint. Not a shoe print, a bare foot, tiny, delicate, pressed lightly into the film of dust covering the stairs. The size matched that of a child, too small to be mine. The edges were sharp and recent, untouched by time. I felt my heartbeat shift into something unsteady, something too fast. I reminded myself that I came here because of the impossible, because of that call, because a part of me was terrified that my sister had been alive all this time and I'd abandoned her. But this didn't feel like her return. This felt like something else entirely. I continued up the stairs slowly, each step awakening more memories than I wanted. The bedroom doors at the top stood open except for one, hers. It sat slightly ajar, just as the front door had, a sliver of darkness visible between the frame and the wood. The rest of the hallway felt dimmer the closer I got to it, as though the air thickened around me. I reached out and pushed the door open. Her room was exactly as she had left it. Not as we found it the day she disappeared, turned upside down by neighbors searching for clues, drawers yanked out, sheets stripped from the bed, but as she had left it the night before. The bed was neatly made, a soft pink blanket folded at the foot. Her bookshelf was full, arranged alphabetically because she used to insist on perfect order. Her stuffed animals sat in a tidy row, each facing the same direction, each looking untouched by time. But there was something else, something out of place. On her small wooden desk sat a ceramic mug, the one she painted in school and insisted on using every morning for hot chocolate. I picked it up, expecting it to be cold and dusty. Instead, a wave of warm air brushed against my fingers. The mug wasn't just warm. It was the exact temperature it would have been if someone had just put it down moments earlier. My hand shook as I set it back down. The house was supposed to be empty, abandoned. No one had lived here since everything fell apart. Yet something here felt alive. I stepped deeper into the room. My camera light swept across her drawings, still taped to the wall, sun-faded but intact. Her backpack hung from the hook beside the bed, the zipper slightly open. A faint pink wristband lay beside it, one she used to wear everywhere. I shouldn't have touched it, but I did. The moment my fingers brushed the wristband, a low creaking sound echoed from above. The ceiling, or maybe the attic. It was the kind of sound a house makes when it settles, but this one sounded like footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving from one side of the ceiling to the other with unnatural calm. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was so sharp, it felt like pressure against my ears. Against my better judgment, I lifted the camera toward the ceiling. The light washed over the textured white paint, harmless and unremarkable. But the longer I stared, the more I felt something was staring back. I stepped away from the center of the room, edging toward the door. As I did, something on the far side of the room flickered, a brief distortion, like heat rising from asphalt on a summer day, a shimmer of air near the corner. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, focused again. Nothing, just shadows. But when I lowered the camera slightly, I felt it, the sensation of being watched. Not from the hallway, not from the window, not even from behind me. From inside the room. I backed out and eased the door closed. Halfway down the hallway, a faint mechanical static drifted from the living room below. The sound grew sharper, unmistakably electronic. I hurried downstairs, my grip tightening on the camera. The television had turned on. The screen flickered with static, the black and white noise dancing violently. For a moment, it was only that. Flashes, flickers, chaos. But then the static sharpened into something else. A dark shape took form in the center of the screen, stretched tall and slender, its limbs too long, its outline too thin. The figure stood motionless, facing the camera as if aware it was being watched. And then the static cut out entirely. The screen went black. My reflection stared back at me in the dark glass, pale, shaken, breathing too fast. I reached toward the power button, my hand trembling. The moment my fingers touched the surface, the TV flashed once more. This time, it wasn't static. It was a room. A room I recognized instantly. My sister's. The image was tilted, like the camera had been placed on the floor. The door was open, light spilling in from the hallway. The toys were lined neatly along the wall. The blanket was folded at the foot of the bed. Everything was motionless, except for one thing. In the corner of the frame, a small silhouette stood facing the wall. A child. Too small to be anyone but her. I sucked in a breath, my mind racing to catch up with what I was seeing. But before I could take a step toward the TV, the figure suddenly turned its head, not fully, not naturally, but just far enough for me to see that the face was wrong. Smooth, blank, as if someone had erased every feature. My hand shot to the power button again, slamming it off. The house fell silent. The only sound left was my breathing, sharp and uneven, echoing in the empty room. For long seconds, I didn't move. I didn't blink. I didn't even think. I just waited for the next impossible thing to happen. But nothing did. Not yet. When I finally turned toward the stairs again, the hallway was dark. Darker than it should have been. As though something or someone stood just beyond the edge of the camera light, waiting for me to climb back up. I didn't. I backed away slowly, forcing myself not to look away from the darkness because some instinct deep inside me whispered that if I turned my back on it, something would move. I reached the front door with shaking hands, stepped outside, and let the night air fill my lungs. Behind me, the house made a sound, a quiet click, like a door gently closing, as if it had been watching me leave. Night wrapped itself around the house as I stood outside, trying to steady my breathing. The cold air helped just a little. It made me feel anchored again, aware of the boundary between my skin and the world. Inside that house, everything felt blurred, as if the walls were trying to swallow me into their old memories. But the moment I stepped out, the night sky reminded me I still existed in reality, whatever that meant in Hollow Creek. I took a few slow steps away from the front door, watching my childhood home through the camera's lens. The windows were dark, still, empty. Too empty. Like the house had shut its eyes the moment I left, pretending to sleep. But I had seen what it was capable of. I knew it wasn't resting. Somewhere deeper in the town, a distant siren wailed before cutting off mid-scream. The sound echoed through the valley, bouncing off the hills with an unnatural sharpness. I swallowed hard, forcing myself not to interpret the silence that followed as a warning. I should have left then, driven away, abandoned this investigation, let the past remain buried. But something wouldn't let me. Maybe guilt, maybe instinct, maybe hope, twisted and fragile. Whatever it was, it pulled me back toward the house like a magnet. I turned off the camera light for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the dimness. The silhouette of the house loomed in front of me, a black shape against darker shadows. The roofline looked crooked, as if the house had aged in ways geometry couldn't explain. A faint glow, almost imperceptible, seemed to pulse behind the attic window. I didn't remember leaving the attic light on. I stood there for a long moment, staring at that dim, pale flicker. It wasn't bright enough to be a bulb. It was more like the soft gleam of moonlight reflecting off something metallic, or the faint glow of eyes watching from behind glass. My skin crawled. I lifted the camera again. The attic window looked normal through the lens, mostly dark, except for that tiny shimmer. I zoomed in. The shimmer moved, just a fraction of an inch, just enough to prove it wasn't a trick of the lighting. I didn't want to go back inside. Every instinct screamed against it. But my sister had vanished without a trace, and that impossible phone call had dragged me across the state back to this cursed place. If something in that attic held an answer, I had to see it. I approached the front door slowly, listening for any sound from inside. Nothing. The house had gone silent again, as if waiting for me. I pushed the door open and stepped back into the living room. The air felt colder than before, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made your fingertips go numb. The TV remained off, its screen reflecting the faint glow of my camera light like an unblinking eye. I walked past it carefully, as though it might turn on again if I moved too quickly. Each step across the living room floor seemed to echo too many times, as if the sound were bouncing around in a space much larger than the house itself. The staircase loomed ahead, darker than I remembered, each step swallowing the light instead of reflecting it. The warmth from earlier had vanished. My sister's room was still at the top, her door closed now. I didn't touch it this time. I didn't even look directly at it. Instead, I headed to the narrow pull-down ladder to the attic. A metal cord dangled from the ceiling, swaying slightly even though the air was still. I reached up, gave the cord a gentle tug, and the thin attic ladder unfolded downward with a slow, metallic groan. Dust drifted into the air, dancing in the beam of the camera like faint ash. For a moment, I hesitated. The ladder was old, flimsy, barely stable, but the faint glow above seemed to pulse once, as if responding to my indecision. So I climbed. Each rung creaked, complaining under my weight. The air grew heavier as I climbed, thick with the smell of old insulation, wood, and something else. Something metallic and sweet, almost like the scent of rust mixed with warmth. The glow grew brighter the higher I went. Not bright enough to see clearly, just enough to cast hints of shapes in the darkness. When my head crossed the edge of the attic opening, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged in the air. The attic stretched wider than I remembered, far too wide for the size of the house below. Shadows dipped and swayed across mounds of old furniture, boxes, toys, and objects I didn't recognize. The faint glow came from the far corner, a slow, pulsing shimmer like the dying breath of a firefly. I stepped onto the wooden planks. They groaned under my feet as if shifting, reluctant to support me. I swept the camera light slowly across the attic. That's when I noticed it. On the far wall, behind dusty crates and forgotten furniture, the wallpaper was torn away in a pattern I didn't recognize. Not random peeling. This looked deliberate. Thin strips pulled downward, long and even, like claw marks or long fingers scraping through it. The exposed wall beneath wasn't normal drywood. It looked darker, damp, as though the house itself had been bleeding. I moved the camera back to the glow. It wasn't a light bulb. It was my sister's missing pendant. The small silver one she wore every day, shaped like a crescent moon. It lay on the floor, flickering gently in a way silver shouldn't. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure if it was real. The glow pulsed once more, brighter now, like a heartbeat. I crouched down and reached for it. The moment my fingers brushed the metal, a wave of warmth rushed through my hand. Warmth like body heat. Someone had held it recently. Someone alive. Or something imitating warmth. The moment I lifted it, the attic made a sound. A low creak near the far wall. Then another. Slow footsteps. Too slow, too heavy to be human. I forced myself to turn, but the attic was a maze of shadow and broken furniture. The camera light wavered as my hand trembled. Somewhere behind the crates, something moved. Just barely visible. Just enough to shift the old boxes. I raised the camera higher. The light passed over an old chair, a trunk, a stack of dusty canvases. Then I saw it. A shape. Tall, too tall. A figure standing perfectly still between two wooden beams, its outline thin and distorted, as if stretched by something unseen. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It didn't even react to the light. It simply stood there, facing me, its head slightly tilted. The face, if it had one, was smooth, empty, like a blank mask carved from darkness. I stepped back slowly, clutching my sister's pendant. The boards beneath me creaked loudly. The sound echoed once, then the figure twitched. Just a fraction of movement, but enough to send cold crawling up my spine. I didn't think. I turned toward the ladder. The attic groaned. The figure moved, not like a person, not like anything natural. Its limbs unfolded in a slow, jerking motion, as if remembering how to use them. Its body stretched unnaturally, bending too far in places no human body could bend. I scrambled toward the ladder, nearly slipping on the uneven planks. The pendant dropped from my hand and skittered across the floor, sliding into the dark. I reached down instinctively, but something in the shadows moved closer, too fast, too intent. I abandoned the pendant. I reached the ladder, grabbed the sides, and descended so quickly the rungs rattled beneath me. The moment my foot hit the hallway floor, the attic ladder snapped upward behind me, as if yanked by invisible hands. The ceiling slammed shut. Dust rained down. The house fell silent again, except for one sound. A faint scraping coming from the other side of the attic hatch. Slow, persistent, like fingertips dragging across wood. Or something with longer fingers than a human. I stumbled backward, chest heaving, and pressed myself against the opposite wall. The scraping grew softer, then stopped altogether. The hallway light flickered once, momentarily plunging the hall into pitch black. When the light returned, the door to my sister's room, closed only minutes ago, now stood open. Wide open, as if inviting me inside. My camera hand shook uncontrollably. I didn't go in. I couldn't. Not after what I had seen. Instead, I backed away slowly until my shoulder bumped the top stair. Something shifted at the far end of the hallway. A shape. A small one. Child-sized. Standing perfectly still in the open doorway of my sister's room. Its head tilted, its body motionless. I blinked, and it vanished. Just gone, as if the shadows swallowed it whole. I didn't breathe again until I reached the front door. I stepped outside into the cold night air and didn't stop moving until I was halfway down the driveway. Behind me, the house settled again. A quiet creak, a soft sigh, as if it were disappointed I'd left. I didn't sleep that night. I don't even think I blinked long enough to soften the burning in my eyes. I sat in my car at the edge of the driveway, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands, staring at the house as if it might move. Sometimes it looked smaller, sometimes taller, like the shadows around it kept shifting its shape in subtle ways. Every few minutes, I thought I saw something pass behind the upstairs curtains. A flicker, a silhouette, a suggestion of movement that made the hair on my neck stand straight up. But dawn eventually crept into the sky, dull and gray, offering me a little courage, or maybe just the illusion of safety. I needed answers, and there was only one person in Hollow Creek who might have them. Mr. Haywood, the neighbor who had lived next to us since before I was born. He was old even back then. Now, if he was still alive, he might be the only tie to the past this town refused to let go of. His house sat crookedly beside ours, half swallowed by overgrown shrubs and bowed tree branches. The windows were yellowed with age, their glass looking brittle and thin. The roof sagged unevenly, as if the house were tired of standing. It didn't look abandoned, though. A faint wisp of smoke curled from the chimney. A porch light flickered weakly despite the daylight. I approached carefully, each step crunching over frost-hardened grass. My legs felt heavy, as if the house behind me had anchored them with invisible hands. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if anything was watching from the windows. The moment I stepped onto Haywood's porch, the wood groaned beneath my feet, louder than it should have. The porch swing rocked slightly, though the air was too still to have moved it. I knocked on the door, waited, then knocked again. The door opened a few inches with a slow scrape. The smell of old paper, cigarette smoke, and something medicinal drifted out. An eye appeared in the crack between the door and the frame, watery and pale blue, too alert for someone his age. He recognized me instantly. The door opened farther, revealing Haywood hunched inside like a shadow that had forgotten how to stretch. He was thinner than I remembered, his skin lined with years of exhaustion. His sweater looked too big on him, sleeves hanging past his wrists. But his gaze was sharp, sharper than any living man's eyes had a right to be at dawn. He stepped aside without a word, as though he had been expecting me. The moment I entered, he shut the door quickly and locked it, then locked a second deadbolt, then slid a heavy iron bar across the bottom. The house creaked around us, as if reacting to the sudden barrier. I stood in the dim hallway, letting my eyes adjust. The house was a maze of clutter, stacks of newspapers reaching nearly to the ceiling, yellowed photographs pinned to corkboards, old radios, journals, and boxes of documents. The air was thick with dust, catching the weak light that filtered through the curtains. Haywood shuffled past me into the living room, gesturing for me to follow. His hands shook slightly, not from age, but from tension. Every few seconds, he glanced at the windows as though expecting someone to peer inside. I followed him quietly, feeling the weight of the silence stretch thin and tight. He lowered himself into an old armchair with a soft grunt, his bones crackling faintly beneath his sweater. I took a seat across from him, careful not to knock over the towers of papers surrounding the chair. The room felt too small, too cramped, as if the house had been shrinking around him for years. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at me with a heavy expression, one filled with dread, guilt, and something else, recognition. I didn't need him to speak to understand he had been carrying a burden for a very long time. He ran a trembling hand over his mouth, breathing out slowly, like someone preparing to confess to something terrible. The light flickered again. For a moment, the living room dimmed to a deep amber glow, and I felt the air tighten. Haywood's voice broke the silence, not loud, not rushed, but deliberate, like every word cost him a year of life. He talked about the night my sister disappeared. He remembered seeing her through her bedroom window, pacing back and forth, her small hands pressed against the glass, looking out into the backyard as if she expected something to crawl out of the tree line. He remembered how she kept turning toward the treetops, flinching at movements only she could see. He remembered the fear in her posture, not the fear of being watched, but the fear of being recognized by whatever she thought was watching. He told me she had been whispering to someone who wasn't there. The tone of his voice shifted when he said this, like he wasn't sure if he should continue. But then he did. He said she was talking quietly into the dark corners of her room, holding her pendant tightly and repeating words over and over. Words he could never fully hear, except one. Stop. Stop following. Stop lurking. Stop hiding. The more he described the night, the colder the air became. It gathered around us, creeping across the floor in slow, invisible waves. I could see Haywood watching the air tremble in front of him, like heat rising from pavement, but cold instead of warmth. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He didn't believe she ran away. He believed something took her. He said Hollow Creek had always been wrong, always been touched by something older than any of the houses, older than any settler, older than the town's first foundation stones. People disappeared in this valley long before we ever arrived. Children especially. Families left suddenly without explanation. Entire houses abandoned in a single night. Doors left hanging open. Food still on the table. He believed the valley watched people, marked them, chose them. Sometimes it left them alone. Sometimes it didn't. And sometimes, he said, it pretended to be them. My skin crawled. I felt the camera in my hand vibrating slightly, as though a subtle tremor had passed through the floorboards. I steadied it, trying to ignore the sinking in my stomach. Haywood leaned back and exhaled shakily. For the first time, he looked old. Not from age, old from despair. Like someone too tired to keep fighting the same unwinnable battle. He said the shadows in Hollow Creek didn't just stretch, they listened. I didn't know what disturbed me more, the decaying house around us, or the certainty in his voice. But then something shifted in the room, a subtle flicker, a momentary darkening, not from the failing lamps, but from something else. The air felt alive again, listening, crawling. Haywood noticed it too. His eyes froze on the hallway leading toward the kitchen. His fingers tightened around the worn arms of his chair. The hair on the back of my neck rose as the floorboards in the hallway creaked under a weight that wasn't ours. Slow, purposeful. One step, then another. The sound approached the living room, but nothing moved. The air thickened with that same metallic smell I had noticed in the attic, sweet and rusted, like a pulse behind old wood. Haywood inhaled sharply and whispered that I shouldn't have come back, that returning to the house had woken something it would have preferred to keep sleeping. Something was aware of me now. Something that remembered my sister. Something that wanted me next. The footsteps stopped just outside the living room doorway. The house went completely silent. Even the ticking of the old grandfather clock beside the window halted, like time itself was holding its breath. I stared at the doorway, waiting for whatever stood behind the wall to reveal itself. Haywood trembled violently now, his eyes fixed on a spot I couldn't see. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. Something crossed the doorway. Not a person, not anything living. A shadow, tall, thin, wrong, slid across the wall like spilled ink, stretching and bending in ways shadow shouldn't bend. It paused near the corner, elongated into a narrow smear, then disappeared through the far wall, leaving behind a chill that crawled up my arms like icy fingers. Haywood collapsed deeper into his chair, shaking, mumbling under his breath. I caught only fragments, warnings, pleas, regrets. Words like curse, valley, marked, and mimic. When the last tremor of cold left the room, he finally forced himself to meet my eyes. And for a moment, he looked almost relieved, as though he had been waiting years for someone else to witness what he could never explain. But then his expression shifted again, tightening into something far more urgent. He told me to leave, right now. And not just leave the house, not just leave Hollow Creek, leave the valley. Because whatever had followed my sister now knew my name too. I stood slowly, trying to process everything, when a faint knock echoed at the back of the house. A soft, rhythmic tapping. 4 taps, a pause, 4 more. The same pattern repeated. Haywood went pale. He whispered that the tapping started the night she vanished, and hadn't stopped until she was gone. Now it had started again. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, and he whispered, "It knows you're here." The tapping didn't stop. It pulsed softly through the walls of Haywood's house like a heartbeat, steady and patient. 4 taps. A brief pause. 4 more. Always the same rhythm, always the same cold echo settling into the wooden beams. It came from the back of the house, from somewhere beyond the kitchen and the narrow mudroom that led to the yard. But the sound was too controlled, too deliberate to be anything natural. Something was signaling. Something that remembered that pattern long before I did. Haywood sat frozen in his chair, his eyes locked on the dark doorway that led deeper into the house. His breathing grew shallow, his face a fragile mask of panic. I could almost hear the years of fear calcifying inside him, cracking wide open now that the tapping had returned. Something about the sound, its rhythm, its confidence, told me this wasn't the first time it had visited him. Not by a long shot. I stepped back toward the front door, careful not to jostle any of the leaning stacks of newspapers or the fragile frames that lined his cluttered walls. The tapping grew louder, then softer, like it could sense me moving, like it shifted its focus toward my footsteps. A cold sensation slid across my spine, tightening with every step I took. Haywood finally forced out a breath and pointed shakily toward the front door, insisting I leave. His voice trembled with urgency, but beneath it lay resignation, as though he knew he couldn't leave himself, as though the house wouldn't let him anymore. When I reached the door, I felt the weight of the house pressing inward, as if hoping I'd decide to stay instead. The moment I stepped outside, the air hit me like a wave of freedom I didn't expect. A dull gray light filtered through the trees, thin and washed out, but it was enough to make the world feel real again. I inhaled deeply, desperately, like I'd been holding my breath inside that house for too long. But the relief didn't last. Behind me, I heard the tapping shift. The rhythm fractured, stretching into something more curious. It followed me to the porch. Then it stopped altogether. The silence was worse. I didn't look back as I crossed the yard and started toward the road. Every instinct screamed at me to put as much distance as possible between myself and that house. But Hollow Creek had its own language. The wind didn't carry whispers here. It carried warnings. And as I walked, I felt them brushing against my ears like faint breaths. The ground crunched beneath my shoes, The trees swayed without wind. The sky seemed to droop lower, as if the valley itself were bending toward me. I checked the camera screen to confirm it was still recording. Its red light blinked steadily. The footage would show everything. Or at least, I hoped it would. Hollow Creek was the kind of place where even recordings might bend to the will of whatever called this valley home. I wasn't planning to go back to my childhood house. Not yet. But somehow, my footsteps led me there anyway. The road curved, pulling me along like a tide that knew where I needed to be. I found myself standing at the foot of the driveway again, staring at the house that had changed overnight. The siding looked darker now, the windows murkier. The porch light flickered weakly, even though I knew I never turned it on. The valley had a way of deciding what should glow and what should be swallowed in shadow. As I approached the front steps, the air thickened, filling my lungs with a damp heaviness. The front door was still slightly open, just as I had left it, but the gap was wider now, as if the house had breathed in during the night and never exhaled. I stepped inside. The temperature dropped instantly, wrapping around me like an unwelcome embrace. The hallway stretched longer than it had the night before. Shadows clung to the corners, refusing to dissolve even when I shined the camera light toward them. The house felt awake now, aware, anticipating. My plan was simple. Gather whatever clues remained, find something, anything, that could explain the phone call, my sister's disappearance, and the thing that followed her shadow. But the instant I stepped into the living room, I realized the house had plans of its own. The living room window was cracked open by an inch. A cold draft crept inside, rustling the curtains in slow, deliberate movements. When I looked closer, I saw the faint outline of a handprint on the glass. Small, almost child-sized. I reached out, hovering my fingers over the imprint without touching it. It was fresh. A sound drifted from upstairs then, a soft thump, followed by the subtle shift of weight across the floorboards. Something was moving above me. Something familiar. Something that moved, just like she used to. My chest tightened. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to focus on the creaking pattern overhead. It was pacing, back and forth, short steps, pauses between them. Exactly the way my sister used to move when she was anxious. I swallowed hard and made my way to the staircase. Each step groaned beneath me, echoing through the still air. When I reached the top, the hallway felt colder than the rest of the house. My breath fogged slightly, even though I knew it shouldn't. The camera light flickered, struggling to stay steady. I walked toward her old room. The door was open, just a few inches, enough for darkness to seep out into the hallway like spilled ink. I pushed it wider. The hinges whined. The room inside was exactly as we left it years ago. Posters on the wall, abandoned toys, the small desk where she used to draw. Dust coated everything in thick layers, except for one thing: her pendant. The silver locket she never took off sat neatly in the center of the floor, free of dust, gleaming faintly in the camera light. I stared at it, unable to move. The pendant had been missing ever since the night she vanished. Seeing it there felt wrong, like the house had returned it intentionally. Slowly, I crouched down and lifted it. It was cold against my fingers, colder than metal should ever be. The moment I touched it, a soft whisper drifted past my ear. Not a breath, not a word. A feeling, a presence brushing against the side of my head. The air behind me thickened. I turned sharply, shining the camera into the hallway. Nothing. But the shadows along the baseboards crawled slightly, retreating into the corners as if they had been caught watching. A faint tapping echoed from somewhere inside the walls. The same 4-measure rhythm from Haywood's house. Quieter, more distant, but unmistakably the same. The valley wasn't just watching, it was circling me. I pocketed the pendant, gripping it tight as I backed out of the room. The house groaned softly, like it disapproved. The shadows pulsed again, stretching in ways shadows shouldn't. My breathing quickened. The stairs creaked behind me even though I hadn't stepped on them yet. Something else had. I bolted down the hall and practically stumbled down the staircase, catching myself on the railing. Whatever was behind me moved with careful, steady steps. Never rushing, never chasing, just following. Mirroring. Always the same pace, always the same distance behind me. As if it wanted me to know it was there, but not yet see it. When I reached the front door, it swung shut before I could grab it. Not slammed, closed. Gently, quietly, deliberately. The air in the foyer pressed against me, heavy and cold, forcing my lungs to work harder for each breath. I grabbed the handle and pulled. At first, it didn't move. The house felt like it was holding it closed, waiting, watching. Then, in a slow, reluctant motion, the door loosened and opened just enough for me to slip through. I didn't look back. Outside, the air felt thin and sharp. The sky had darkened again, even though it should have been noon. Clouds twisted overhead, gathering in unnatural spirals that hovered above the tree line. The wind picked up suddenly, carrying the faintest sound, something between a sigh and a voice too distant to understand. I climbed into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine with shaking hands. The camera sat on the passenger seat, still recording, still blinking. The pendant felt like ice in my pocket. Before I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced at the house one last time. The upstairs curtain in my sister's room shifted. Not from wind, from someone standing behind it. And the shape was the exact height she had been the year she went missing. My throat tightened, my pulse hammered. Then the curtain fell still, and I drove away, leaving the house staring after me like a living thing. I kept driving long after Hollow Creek disappeared behind the trees, though the valley felt like it clung to the back of the car, refusing to let go. The road twisted unnaturally, bending like something alive had shaped it long before asphalt was laid. The sky hung heavy and bruised, choked with clouds that moved too slowly to be real. Every mile should have taken me farther from the weight of the place, yet the air inside the car stayed cold and damp, carrying a faint metallic tang that reminded me of the attic, the shadow in the wall, the whisper at Haywood's door. The pendant I had taken from my sister's room lay on the passenger seat, unmoving, yet somehow I felt it pulsing, not visibly, not physically, but like a memory that breathed. Its presence filled the car as surely as the fog gathering along the road. More than once, I caught myself glancing at it, expecting to see it facing toward me, watching. By the time I reached the stretch of forest that marked the edge of town, my chest tightened with a familiar dread. The trees leaned close to the road, their branches drooping like tired arms. They swayed without wind, and their bark looked darker than it should, almost black. At first, I thought it was shadows, but shadows didn't pulse or shimmer. The forest looked like it was breathing. The radio flickered on again. Static washed through the car in a thick wave, swallowing the last bit of silence I had left. I reached to turn it off, but the dial wouldn't move. The static deepened, sinking into a lower pitch that vibrated the steering wheel under my hands. It wasn't random noise anymore. It was a pattern. A voice buried beneath distortion, straining, reaching. I slowed the car as the voice rose through the static, stretching thin like an old tape warped by heat. I leaned forward instinctively, even though I knew better. Even though every instinct screamed at me to shut it off, to get out, to run, to disappear. But something inside the static tugged at me, a tone, a rhythm, a softness, like the memory of someone I loved calling me from another room. When the voice finally broke through the static, the sound cut through my skin like cold glass. It said my name, once, slowly, exactly the way my sister used to say it when she was scared. My hands froze around the steering wheel. The road blurred beneath the headlights, swallowed by the fog rolling in from both sides. I felt my pulse echo in my palms, in my throat, in my spine. The voice repeated my name again, clearer this time, softer, closer. Something inside me cracked. The car rolled to a stop at the side of the road, the fog pressing against the windows like a living wall. The engine hummed quietly, a low vibration that felt insignificant against the weight of the voice rising through the static. The pendant on the seat vibrated. Just once. Barely perceptible, but enough to make me recoil as though it had burned my skin. I stared at it, frozen. Then the radio hissed again, and the static bent around a whisper. Long, slow, stretching into a sound that scraped against the edge of comprehension. I turned toward the pendant. It wasn't lighting up, it wasn't moving, but the air around it shifted, thickened, warped, as if heat rose from it in waves, though the car was cold enough to fog the windows. My breath froze in the air before me, drifting in slow, heavy wisps. The temperature dropped in a blink, biting through my jacket and sinking into my bones. The radio crackled sharply, and then a different sound emerged. A soft tapping. 4 taps. A pause. 4 more. Like the pattern in Haywood's house. But it wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from behind me. The tapping drummed softly against the back windshield, slow and patient. The fog outside thickened, swirling like something moved through it. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My hands clenched the wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. The tapping continued, persistent and steady, marking each second as if counting down. 4 taps. Pause. 4 taps. Pause. Then silence. And something else. The faintest sound of breath behind my ear. I closed my eyes, only for a second, but long enough for the air to shift, long enough for the cold to deepen into something sharp. When I opened them, the passenger seat was no longer empty. The pendant was gone. My heart lurched painfully. My breath caught in my throat. I scanned the seat, the floor, the dashboard, but the pendant wasn't anywhere. My chest felt hollow. The tapping had stopped, but the valley felt closer. The fog pressed harder against the windows. Then I felt it. A weight. Light, delicate, cold, resting on my shoulder. A hand. Small, familiar. My pulse thrashed in my ears as the static on the radio faded into a low hum. I couldn't turn my head. My muscles locked, frozen by terror and something else. A pull I couldn't explain. A recognition too painful to deny. The hand tightened slightly, as if adjusting its grip. The cold seeped through my jacket, through my skin, crawling into my chest. Then a whisper drifted across the back of my neck. Not behind me, beside me. As if someone were leaning their face close to mine. The voice sounded like hers, but stretched, empty. A shadow of what my sister once was. It said my name again, softer than breath. I inhaled, shaking, my vision blurring. The fog outside the car twisted into a spiraling motion, circling the vehicle like a slow, deliberate tide. The trees beyond it seemed to bow inward, bending toward me, reaching. The valley didn't want me to leave. The weight on my shoulder lifted, slowly, gently, then slid down my arm. Cold fingers brushed my wrist. My breath caught as a small object dropped into my palm. The pendant, warm now, alive. The radio went silent. The fog outside pressed hard against the windshield, thick enough to hide the world completely. For a moment, there was nothing. No road, no forest, no sky. Just gray, suffocating emptiness. And then, through the fog, a single whisper came from the back seat of the car. The same voice as before, only closer now, clearer, almost human. It leaned forward and spoke one word. Brother?